Greetings, family. Greetings, family. I am excited about today. I want to welcome you back to the Faith Evolution Podcast. Listen, I'm excited because I made a promise that we would always have real conversations, and particularly the conversations you're not really going to get in Bible in Bible school or Sunday school or Bible class at your church. We're going to have these tough conversations that people really shy away from, but that doesn't mean that they're not still vital conversations. And so I'm so glad today to be discussing this vitally important conversation about conversion therapy. Now, you may not know what conversion therapy is, but after we are done with today's conversation, you absolutely will know. And I think that it's so important that we do get a good understanding of this, because this is a phenomenon that is changing shape, is changing form in this particular generation. It looked a little different 20, 30 years ago, but because of people coming out against it, they're adjusting how they're going about it. So you need to be informed about what it is and what the experience has been for those who have actually gone through it. And so I am so excited about being able to have a conversation tonight about that very topic. So let me introduce the gentleman who will be my conversation partner this afternoon, this evening, this morning, whenever it is that you happen to be watching. His name is Lucas Wilson, and he is an SS HRC postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and was formerly the Justice Equity. There's that word that it's very unpopular to use in the United States today, but he was formerly the Justice, Equity, and Transformation postdoctoral fellow at University of Calgary. He is also the editor of Shame, Sex, Attraction: Survivors' Stories of Conversion Therapy. And before I go on, let me just put this up, because this is a vitally important resource for you to get. This is available on Amazon, and I'm sure we're going to have a conversation about it momentarily, but I just want to put this up because this is I think it's a very, very important part of your library, that you have access to these real life stories of people who have gone through conversion therapy and have survived. So Shame, Sex, Attraction: Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy. And that was edited again by our guest today. He's also the author of At Home with the Holocaust: Post Memory, Domestic Space, and Second Generation Holocaust Literature, which received the Jordan Schnitzer First Book Publication Award. His public-facing writing has appeared in The Advocate, it's appeared in Queerty, LGBTQ Plus Nation, and Religion Dispatches, among other among other venues. And so it is truly, truly my pleasure indeed to welcome to the Faith Evolution Podcast my guest, Dr. Lucas Wilson. Good afternoon
Hello.
or evening.
How are you?
I'm pretty good. How are you today?
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's very exciting to be here.
I'm honored. I really am honored, because I've had a lot of conversations, even in terms of the LGBTQ plus work that I do, but rarely have I had a conversation with someone who has actually gone through conversion therapy. So I am really looking forward to having this conversation with you. First of all, thank you for your openness and your willingness to share your story. I am sure that story is having quite an impact.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure to raise awareness and to shine a light on the topic. I think that, even recently in Missouri, right, there's been some legislation that's been pushed forward that is pro-conversion therapy. That in North Dakota, in Kentucky, right, like within the past few weeks, this is something that is not a thing of the past. This is very much something that's happening, and so we need to talk about it in order to see an end to it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you for helping to lead that conversation. Listen, so I read your bio, but just in your own words, tell our audience something about yourself.
Well, born and raised in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, though most of my adulthood was spent in the States. Most of my schooling was in the States, in Tennessee, Virginia, and Florida, and then also back in Ontario, where I'm from. But finished my PhD 3 years ago. Did one postdoc at University of Calgary in the history department and was working on this collection that we're going to be talking about today, Shame, Sex, Attraction, as well as my other book, At Home with the Holocaust, and a few articles and book chapters and whatnot. And then now I'm in my second postdoc at University of Toronto, Mississauga, and working on a few related projects. But yeah, I mostly am a literary critic and also a creative writer and a historian and a religious studies scholar. And so I do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Just try to, yeah, try my hand in different disciplines, different fields, and the work that I do is my passion.
I think that's great because you have this personal experience, but you're able to also filter that through the lens of, or at least speak the language of academia, to add that piece to it. And I think that certainly helps to give credibility. Personally, I think the only credibility we need is our personal experience. But for people that we're trying to reach with this message, right, a lot of times credentials matter. So the fact that you're out there doing the work, I think is absolutely wonderful. So as someone who's actually experienced conversion therapy, going through that, I think it's probably safe to assume that you're part of the LGBT community. But, you know,
how did you know?
Right? You know, it's like, I'm guessing here. I'm guessing, but, you know, so what part of the community are you? And tell me a little about how you came to be aware about that part of who you are.
Yeah, so I'm a gay man. I knew I was gay since I was a little kid. It was never a question really deep down, though it was made a question for me. And I think that's where we get into all this trouble for queer folks, especially queer folks who eventually choose to go into conversion therapy. We can talk more about how that was a choice and how it wasn't a choice, a both and sort of situation. But for me, I mean, I knew that I was attracted to men from a very young age. But like I said, it was made into a question for me as time went on, right? I wasn't raised in a Christian home. I was raised in a home with maybe an agnostic father and a mother who was haunted by her Baptist demons, maybe is one way of putting it. And so that kind of came out, and, you know, my mom's religious background came out as I was, you know, growing up. And I knew from an early age that it was not going to be okay to talk about my sexuality with at least her. My dad, I honestly just don't think he would have given two hoots, but that was very much sort of his MO. He was, you know, very liberal in the traditional or classical sense of the word, like open to everything and anything, and as long as it didn't, you know, impinge upon others. And so my dad was just phenomenal, though my dad passed away when I was in high school. And so that avenue to talk about it, I think, was closed for me because, you know, I didn't have him to talk about these things. And so for my mom, though, as I got older and older, again, there was more and more messaging that made it more and more, made it clearer and clearer that it was not going to be okay to articulate the fact that I was attracted to men. And it was also coinciding at a time where I myself was becoming religious. So in grade 9, so the beginning of high school, I decided that I was, you know, I was sort of fascinated by like the creation versus evolution debate, which looking back, like, what the hell was I thinking? But anywho, at the time I, you know, was interested in, and I thought that, you know, okay, if I believe that there is a God, then I should go figure out who this creator or this, you know, intelligent designer is. And that's when I went to the church that when I was really little, you know, when I was up until about grade 2 or 3, my family would go to this church on and off. But like every good Canadian family, we would just go to the cottage instead. So by the time I got to high school, though, I was like, well, you know what? If I believe there's this creator, I should go and, you know, explore this. And so I went to this church. And so I went to that church, became a Christian, became super religious. And again, I knew that my mom was happy about that, but I also knew that it was going to be a really safe place for me as a queer kid to be, because, you know, of course, within the evangelical imagination, emphasis on imagination, you know, being queer and being a Christian are mutually exclusive. You can't be both according to this religious tradition. And so I thought, well, if I'm Christian, then no one's going to know I'm gay. And it's like, looking back, like I went to Rosedale Heights School of the Arts. You know what I mean? Like the writing was on the wall. I watched a lot of HGTV. I cooked. You know, people knew I was a big old homo. But I thought that I was doing a very good job at concealing it until I found out.
We call it glass houses, right?
That's it. So I just so I think at the time for me, the church was ironically a safe place. And obviously it was in every other way not a safe place, because again, had I come out to them, I certainly wouldn't have been part of that community in the way that I was, right? And so for me, by the time I got to university or was about to go to university, I was making the decision where I wanted to go. I started seriously thinking about, again, like, was I going to stay in Toronto or was I going to go elsewhere? Well, my mom's cousin, we just called him Uncle Gary. He's not technically my uncle, but Uncle Gary had said, like, hey, do you want to come down and visit Liberty University for a weekend to see
Oh
if you
my.
want to go there? And I had no idea what Liberty University was, right? Like, I in Canada, like, the university experience is very much like, how do you say? It's very much like boring. It's just like not exciting in the way that for the US, like the US, like university and college life and all this, everyone knows where they're going to go. They're going to be a Tar Heel from their by when they're 6, and like we're like grade 11 and we still don't know where we're going to go. But people from the US certainly, it's a big thing. It's a bigger experience. It's more, I think, exciting than it is in Canada. So I didn't know about, I mean, I knew, again, like in vague terms, that there was this Christian school, but I didn't know anything really about this school. And so he had said to me, do you want to come down for this trip? And so I was like, sure, it's a free trip to Virginia. Actually, I didn't say sure. Initially, I said, no, I don't want to go to Virginia. I was like, Lynchburg, Virginia doesn't sound like that much fun to me.
Right.
There's more to say about the name Lynchburg, but, we'll put a pin in that for now. And so the thing about this school, like he said, like, let's go down. And I was like, it sort of took some convincing, but again, eventually I was like, sure, let's go. So I went, and for me, as a young evangelical, like, Liberty is like Christian, it's like a Christian amusement park. Like, it's just this like ridiculous campus with, like, it's huge, and again, everything's bigger in the US, and so everything was more exciting. And then they also tried to put on a really big show, and they put literally shows on, like, we're like, I think like Switchfoot was there, and like all these like Christian artists and all this, tomfoolery. And so all of this, I go down, and afterwards I come back and I'm like, I want to go to Liberty. And so I did, but the big, and eventually I did choose to go to Liberty University. We can talk more about that after. But what really sealed the deal for me was the fact that I was made aware on one of those trips. I actually went down to Liberty 6 times to check out the school. But it was on one of those trips, and it was early on in one of those trips that I discovered that they had a conversion therapy program. I knew that because they had these announcements wherever they projected the lyrics for worship music. They were also announcing before and after chapel, on-campus events. And one of those on-campus events was the fact that there was someone on campus who was paid to help students who were, quote unquote, struggling with same-sex attraction, which of course the title of my book is a play on that. We can get more into that later. But I remember seeing this, announcement for, something along the lines that said, like, are you struggling with same-sex attraction? And I was like, yes, I am, as a matter of fact. And I then, clocked that, and sort of, I later on I asked someone at the school, I was like, hey, what's that tomfoolery or that monkey business about this like guy on campus who's able to help people struggling with same-sex attraction? And my friends, we were like, oh, it's Pastor Dane Emmerich, this guy that does whatever. And so who does, they didn't call it conversion therapy, but obviously looking back, that's exactly what it was. And so I knew that they had this program, and I knew that, that in order for me to remain an evangelical, for me to remain within the fold, I needed to align myself with the ethic that is, evangelicalism. And a big part of that, of course, is being straight.
Absolutely.
And so when I was making my decision on where I was going to go, I decided that ultimately I was going to go there. That was the sort of like the biggest sort of factor into why I eventually chose to study there. And, looking back, we all make decisions, and I don't think I made a very good decision. Again, we could talk more about that, but that was the decision I made. And then I went down to Liberty, and again, we'll obviously dive into that. But I went for 4 years. I was in their conversion therapy program.
4 years. Wow. So we have been talking about conversion therapy. We haven't defined it yet. So what is conversion therapy for anybody who may not actually know?
Yeah, so conversion therapy is the effort or efforts to change an individual's sexual orientation or to change an individual's gender identity or gender expression, all of which to align to the heteronormative model, right? So, straight and cis. So if you are gay, if you're lesbian, if you're bisexual, if you're trans, if you're non-binary, if you're queer, if you're whatever under the LGBTQ, plus umbrella, that is considered wrong. That is considered deviant. That is considered not the norm. And so they try to, through a number of different methods, align you with the heteronormative model. And nowadays, a lot of the ex-gay ministries won't necessarily say that they're trying to make you straight, because I think they've realized that well, obviously doesn't happen, and no one has ever become straight, and no one ever will become straight because it's impossible. But they know that that's bad PR. So now what they say is that they're not looking for heterosexuality; they're looking for wholeness or holiness, and so sexual wholeness and gender wholeness, whatever the hell that is. We can get into more of that as well. But what they are talking about is trying to get you to at least feign heteronormativity, right? So to perform, and obviously the operative word here is to perform, to act, to be something that is not natural to the individual, in order to align with, again, the heteronormative model. Because oftentimes, at least in a lot of the iterations of conversion therapy that are in the New Christian Right contexts, a lot of what we're talking about is when they'll say that at its core, if you are queer, if that's gender queer or sexually queer, it's a gender issue at the root. And so what they mean by that is that, for me, and let's use me as an example, I, as a gay man, am only gay because at somewhere along the lines, I did not align with what it meant to be a man. And of course, when they say to be a man, they mean a straight man, they mean a cis man. And for me, somewhere along the line, I didn't align with that. So really what they try to figure out, as if there's anything to figure out, but they try to figure out where along, the path did I deviate from the heteronormative model, which again, eventually caused me to become attracted to men. So they say that at its root, it's a gender issue. So when I was a kid, I, in some ways, aligned with what it meant to be a boy, but in a lot of ways I didn't, right? Like I was, in my sister's closet, sort of a poetic moment, trying on her clothes, eating her makeup and wearing her makeup and playing with her toys, that kind of stuff. And so they said because of that, and because of a number of other things, including my relationship to my mom, my relationship with my dad was, according to them, quite normal. My dad was phenomenal. My dad was very supportive, and it was amazing. Whereas my mom was overbearing. And so that aligns with their narrative that this is one of the reasons, or a contributing reason, if not the contributing reason, as to why I eventually, started living more comfortably in the world of girls. So they say that when I was a kid, here I am playing with my sister's toys, doing, these quote unquote girly things. And by the time I hit puberty, again, according to this thinking, I went for what was opposite of me. And of course, evangelicals trade very heavily in the binary, right? Opposite of me. If I was, living in the world of girls, well, what did that mean? Oh, I was living in the world, or I was desiring the world of boys. And so at puberty, you are attracted to what's opposite. Again, this binary system. And so I was attracted to men, or boys, I guess, at the time, and then later men, because I was not living in the world of men. Had I been living in the world of men, oh, well, I would have been attracted to women, according to this thinking. So over time, through habituated, performance of, living in the world of girls, I solidified my gender identity, which was, again, more so aligned with women or girls or femininity. And my sexual identity, in turn, changed. Now, what conversion therapists will claim is that if you are to change at its, again, the root cause, which according to this thinking is the gender identity issue, if I'm to change my gender identity, then I will start not only acting like a man and starting performing like a man. I will not just act like a man, I'll become a man. And of course, once I become a man, in turn, my sexuality will change as well. And so that's the delusion that these people operate under, that if you are to change someone's gender performance over time, that will not just be a performance, it'll just be who they are. And then, well, what also will change is their sexuality in turn. So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about conversion therapy, specifically in the New Christian Right. There are perhaps some nuances, there are different models. There's the reparative model, there's the addiction model, but ultimately they sort of all trade in the same tomfoolery and stupidity, really, to use the best academic language I know. And so this is what we mean by conversion therapy. It's efforts to change someone's sexuality or gender because it is believed that their sexuality or gender is wrong.
And I love the fact that as you were describing that, one of the things that you identified was the evolving language and the evolving approaches, because they realize now that some of the things that they've been saying and pitching is actually not true. And so now they're acknowledging the fact that we're not really changing a person's orientation. Now we're just we're allowing you to be whole within your orientation, And so that language has been evolving. And so I think that it's important that people are aware of that, because just because it looks different, just because they're calling it something different, they're approaching it in a different way. In some ways, because the law is not allowing them to do what they used to do. So they're shifting gears, but it's still, we call it the okie doke, right? It's still going to do that bait and switch and get you right where you don't want to be. So we have to just be uber vigilant to make sure that we're not falling prey to these ever changing, ever evolving tactics. You mentioned something in your when you were describing your own personal history, and I think that it's very important to kind of flesh this out about the choice to be involved in conversion therapy and how, of course, that looks different from person to person, but oftentimes it involves either the individual themselves and or their parents. So what was that like for you, and kind of even in terms of the stories that you have collated, what was that like for some of your the people that you have shared their stories in your book?
So the first thing, if we can rewind to what you were saying, I think it's something that's super important just to underscore because you said it, I think, super well. It's just a matter of giving an example or a few examples. So you were talking about how the shifting language, right, and how these conversion practices are oftentimes obfuscated by way of euphemism. So instead of saying, "Oh, we're practicing conversion therapy," they say, "Oh," and this is oftentimes the language that they use is that they're practicing pastoral
Mm.
counseling or biblical
Wow.
worldview counseling or biblical counseling, whatever it might be, right? And so I think that, like you said, so many of these conversion therapists, these geniuses, um, they realized that it was bad marketing to be talking about these things as, or these practices as conversion therapy, and so they switched to something that was much more palatable, particularly for their co-religionists, which is the idea of pastoral counseling. We all
Right,
trust
right,
pastors, right? Biblical counseling. We all trust the Bible, of course, because how could you question the Bible? So it's this kind of stuff. It's this sort of language that's used. Um, and like the term you used is also very apt, the idea of bait and switch. It's like, oh, I'm coming for pastoral counseling for to become whole or holy myself, um, and yet what you find once you're in there is that that's not what they're not offering anything along those lines. They're doing exactly what they've been trying to do
right.
for years. They're just calling it something different. So 100%, and I think that's super important because it's all these dog whistles that are used where those of us who have our ear to the ground, we know what they're saying, we know what they're talking about, we know what they're calling for and what they're offering, whereas a lot of people don't. And so I think it's very, very much important that if we ever do see anything like this, to call it out for what it is and to label it as for precisely what it is, which is conversion therapy. So um, the second part of your question, I'm now realizing I don't remember because I went off on a tangent, and I'm so sorry. What
No
was the
problem.
first,
I
the
really
second
shouldn't have
part?
had two parts anyway, so it's perfectly fine. But I was asking about your experience in relation to the choice of going to conversion therapy and how much of that was your choice, how much of that was your parents, or any other social factors.
Yeah. So for me, because my mom somehow didn't know I was gay, like again, how the mystery is, it's unsolved. But nonetheless, she didn't know, so I didn't ever have that at least maternal pressure to go into conversion therapy because she was again, and she was so surprised when it came out when I was 25. But again, who knows how that was possible? But putting her aside, for me, yes, it was a choice, and I do always take responsibility. But there was actually recently, it's funny how you have a certain narrative in your head and you go with that narrative for a very long time, and then someone comes along and disrupts that narrative. And the narrative that was disrupted was that I always said for a long time that, yes, it was my choice. I'm at the end of the day, I'm the person to blame for this. I'm the one who said I want to go into this. And that person said, but do we say that, when someone's been abused, that it was their choice to be in that relationship, or that it was their choice to be abused? Yes, they were in that relationship, that was their choice, but was it their choice to be abused? No. And conversion therapy definitionally is abuse, right? And conversion therapy definitionally is, a death dealing practice that, according to some, including the 2019 UN Rapporteur on Torture, has described it as torture, right? And so this is something, when I make that claim now, I always have to say this, and I sort of offer that, that revision that's been given to me, which I think is really helpful, and offered me a lot of clarity on my own experience, that yes, I made that decision, but at the same time, there were a lot of complicating factors behind that. And those complicating factors really were the social and the religious pressures put upon me by my religious community, right? So when I was in high school, and when I was at Liberty, I was very much in the world of evangelicalism. I was, heavily involved in youth group in high school, and then heavily involved in, everything at Liberty. I was sort of had my hand in every pot. But when I look back and I think about the idea of agency, right, of choice, how much of this was my choice, you know, who in their right mind is going to choose to live a life that is contrary to who they are, right? In the sense, for me, and to use my I guess, to sort of flesh that statement out, for me, who, like, why in the world would I have chosen to try to get rid of something that simply was never A, wrong in the first place, but B, something that could never change, right? Like, what would cause someone, if I oftentimes use the example of, if I said to a woman, if I was an evangelical pastor and I said to her, hey, well, it's not that I think that, I don't really care too much about X, Y, and Z, but I just don't think it's okay for you to be a woman. That person would say, well, then well, then you don't like me, or you think that I'm wrong. And that person would say, no, it's not you. It's just your womanhood. Well, I just don't think it's real and I don't agree with it. It's like, well, no, like, then you don't see me, right? And it's like if someone says, I don't see race, I don't see sexuality, I don't see gender. No, all these parts, they're not the totality of who we are, but they certainly are constitutive aspects of who we are.
Yes.
And for us to say, I don't see you as a black man, it's, well, then you don't see me. It's like, you don't see you as a gay man, well, then you don't see me, right? Like, these are, it doesn't make sense. These are nonsensical statements. And so for me to look back and say, like, to think, like, like, why in my right mind would I say, like, I want to get rid of something that's just, like, part of who I am? It's like, I just want to get rid of my left arm. It's like, well, no, I don't. Like, who wants that? No one does. And so when I say that, I wanted to become straight, I think the more accurate way of putting it was, I was made to believe I wanted to become straight. I was made to believe that I wanted to enter conversion therapy and receive pastoral counseling, as it was framed at the time. So again, there is this agency question, right? Like, yes, I chose this, but at the same time, I was a part of a system that really disallowed me to see myself for who I was and what I wanted, and precluded me from making intelligent decisions. Because again, evangelicalism is an anti-intellectual sort of world-building project, enterprise, whatever you want to call it. And for me at the time, I was very much trading in this world. And so again, yes, I made the decision, but at the same time, I think it's a complicated discussion to have. And I'm not trying to absolve myself of anything, but at the same time, I'm also trying to be honest with, 17-year-old Luke, when he went to it would have been 18-year-old at the time I was actually in his heads. 18-year-old Luke, again, he was sort of a dumb teenager, and a part of a system that really didn't allow him to think the way that he could have and should have, but nonetheless pushed him into this. And that's where I found myself, and that's how I found myself in conversion therapy.
But you're supposed to be a dumb teenager, because dumb and teenager kind of go hand in hand. And so it's almost like you were being exploited in many ways because of those lack of experiences. But I mean, heck, we could fast forward 10 years, 20 years, even 30 years and still find people who are in those same boats. But I love the clarity of that distinction that you drew in relation to this idea of choice. It reminds me of the movie The Matrix, and how it's like choice and free will are really just illusions that the computer world in this movie gave in order to make one feel like they actually were making a choice. And I was thinking about that in relation to like psychology and religious conditioning and manipulation, really, that there is an illusion of choice, but ultimately they've already fixed the game to cause you to ultimately make the decision that they want you to make. And I think that's so powerful, because it really does, I think at least, help a person to maybe come to terms with that question of like, how did I get here? And was it my fault? And so I love the example of you mentioning about the abusive relationship, and how one chooses the relationship, but they don't choose the abuse in that relationship. I think that's so powerful.
Well, even what you're saying there, like this idea of like, there's a choice, but so often there's not a choice. I mean, in a lot of ways, it even goes back to sort of like the epistemic aspect of evangelicalism, or sort of like the epistemic foundation, which is to say that, there's always one right answer within evangelicalism, right? There's never any ambiguity. That's not a black, it's not this sort of like, there's a gray area. It's black or white, right or wrong, good or evil, of the enemy, of God, right? It's one or the other. Again, going back to the idea of like a binary system, which isn't the most intellectually honest system. But there's always one answer. And so you're always pushed towards one thing, and you don't really have the luxury, or the, what's the word? Like you don't have diversity of opinion, right? And then you also don't have diversity, right?
Correct.
You don't have equity, you don't have a lot of things, you don't have inclusion. Even what you're saying, in the beginning, in the intro, like you're absolutely right. Like diversity and equity and inclusion, and all of these sorts of words that for those of us outside of this system are obviously good words, or obviously things that you want to celebrate and uphold and promote. Whereas within the evangelical tradition, diversity is a bad word. They are allergic to
Yeah,
difference, right? Like it is very much, it's a white
it is.
system, right? It's a straight system. It's a male dominated androcentric system, right? There's all, and we can keep going if we want to use other descriptors. But like those are defining features of this religious tradition. And to be anything outside of that is to be suspect. It is to be wrong in a lot of ways, right? And so I think that, what you were saying, it just makes total sense, because again, there's just within this world, within this cosmology, there's only one right answer, and the right answer is always Jesus, even though there's a lot more complexity to the world than just saying Jesus or the resurrection, right? It's just sort of, that's it. And again, it's where all the answers are predetermined for you. And in that kind of world, that's a really scary world to live in, because it's obviously like lends itself incredibly well to abuse. It lends itself incredibly well to the manipulation of. But again, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about conversion therapy, and that's why it's sort of runs wild within these systems, because this is a system that is the soil is set for these sorts of abuses.
Absolutely. We talked about you going into conversion therapy and what that looked like. I'm almost hesitant to even ask this question, because it's like, gosh, this has to be like, traumatic in a way of dredging up these feelings. But what was it like coming out? Like, what did that look like for you? And I know that some people don't make it to the other side, but what was that like for you?
Yeah. So what I will say to allay any sort of like anxiety about asking me, because I first of all, I talk about this all the time, and so there's no, for me at this point, it's not where I get worked up over it, or anything like that, or it's not overly upsetting. For me, I will say that there is a lot of, well, I'll first say there were like there was a lot of damage done, right? There was a lot of unpacking that had to be done after the fact, and a lot of undoing, of the damage that sort of had been wreaked upon me. And a lot of the damage for me really was what came after conversion therapy. Like within in the moment for me, and I can give you a little bit of an idea of what it was like to be in the actual room for me. In the beginning of the sessions that I was a part of, a lot of it really was talk therapy. And so we started off with a very pseudo-Freudian approach to human sexuality, where, Dane Emmerich, my conversion therapist, he would ask me a lot of questions about my relationship to my mom, to my dad, and that's where we got into the whole my mom's overbearing, therefore this is the reason for me being gay. So there was that sort of like intellectual, if we can call it intellectual, sort of foundation set for the rest, or psychoanalytic, again, really poorly done psychoanalysis, but psychoanalytic sort of approach to how I became queer. And so that's what the first few sessions were about, and a lot of really invasive and highly personal questions about my like teenage sexual proclivities, which looking back like is so bizarre and so like weird that this 60, 70-year-old man was asking me a lot of really detailed questions about my sex life and like what I was into and what kind of porn I liked, this kind of stuff. Just bizarre, but that was certainly part of it. And so once we had established where the quote unquote root cause of my queerness, we then would do it was sort of this like weekly routine where we read scripture. We read from this book. My book was Alan Mediger's Growth into Manhood, Resuming the Journey. Kind of a hilarious title looking back, but anyway, that was the title of my conversion therapy manual. And then we would always do like a weekly inventory of my slip-ups and my victories. Slip-ups were times that I gave into temptation. Victories were the times that I avoided temptation. If I was feeling tempted to look at porn and instead I went for a run, that's a victory, whatever. But again, this man was really highly interested in a lot of my sexual activity, and asked a lot of detailed questions, a lot of follow-up questions too, about what I had done, whether it been just looking at a man or looked at porn. Even though Liberty had an anti-porn blocker, they didn't have an anti-porn blocker for French websites, and as a Canadian, I speak okay French, or at the time I did, I should say more accurately. Now it's pretty bad, but So I was able to always get around it. And so I would have to talk about these things, right? So these were the things that I would talk about, and he would ask me like, "Oh, why do you think this?" or "Why did you do this?" or whatever. It's like, well, because I have a teenage age libido, but all right. Anywho, looking back, just very highly personal questions, very invasive and very inappropriate. There was also a physical aspect to it in the sense that he always, every time I would greet him and every time I would say goodbye to him, there was this big bear hug. And at the time, I sort of chalked it up to, he was giving me a bear hug to show me how men can touch in a non-sexual way, almost like good touch, bad touch, like infantilizing craziness. But I also look back and I'm like, you hugged me for quite some time, and you really like to like really grab onto me. In addition to when we would pray, he would either put his hand on my shoulder, or what seemed to happen more often than not was his hand on my leg. And it wasn't just on my knee; it was like on my thigh. Not too much to the point where I was like, oh, okay, this is weird, but enough that I clocked it, enough that I was like, this is weird, but without me feeling too uncomfortable. And so this physical aspect was also certainly part of it. And so these were the things that these were the hallmarks of my weeks with him when I would meet with him over the 4 years of my undergrad. However, and a lot of people say like, oh, that doesn't sound that bad, or that doesn't sound too terrible, which is always a very privileged thing to say coming from the outside, but I digress. The other part, though, I will say is that in comparison to what happened after, I would say it wasn't as bad, right? In the sense that when I would meet with him, oftentimes he would, after I would confess my, slip ups, or I had talked about X, Y, and Z that, I had done that was wrong either recently or long before, or just the idea that like, obviously within the evangelical tradition, or within evangelical traditions, more accurately, I should say, queerness is oftentimes framed as the worst sin. It's oftentimes framed as, the most disgusting thing you could possibly struggle with. And so a lot of his work was trying to undo that. And not to give him any credit, because the man doesn't deserve any credit, but at least he was doing his best to, help me in that sense. However, although he was on a weekly basis making me feel not as guilty about what I had done, and if we think about guilt as sort of like, think about it in the court of law, I do something bad, slap me on the wrist, you put me in jail for, I don't know, a year, and then I get out. I'm not a bad person. It's just that I was guilty for that one infraction or transgression or bad thing that I did. I'm punished for that one specific thing, but that doesn't define me as a person. Now, guilt in comparison to shame is obviously something very different. Shame is where, oh, it's not just that I did something bad, it's I am bad, right? It's where that I didn't do this one discrete action. It's that my entire life is defined by these actions, which in turn makes me a defective, dirty, disgusting, deplorable, whatever, D word apparently you want to use. So dirtbag, I guess, is another one. Anyway, we can think of other synonyms, but we won't for now. We're not a thesaurus. Anywho, so all this to say is that, the guilt that I had felt at the time, where I had done these bad things, I don't know, looked at porn or lusted or whatever, that Dane, my conversion therapist, were making me feel better about in the moment or in that week, I didn't have that quote unquote support once I left Liberty. Once I graduated, I wasn't going to a conversion therapist anymore. And I didn't have that person to constantly say, oh, you're doing a good job, you're going in the right direction, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus and all things will be well and God will be on God's throne. That was no longer a part of my reality. So what started happening was that I was told in conversion therapy that if I just, again, did the right things, prayed the right stuff, said the right things, acted a certain way, over time, I would habituate this, heterosexual persona. And that wouldn't just be a persona at a certain point, that would just be me, and I would become straight. Well, obviously that didn't happen. And those same struggles that were happening and the same things I was doing while I was at Liberty, I was doing afterwards, and nothing was changing. So I started realizing it's not a matter of, oh, over time, things are just going to get better. And if I keep up this, habituated program of gendered performance, that I'm going to eventually become straight. I realized, no, this is who I am. Like, this is precisely who I am, because nothing's changing and nothing ever will change, because nothing did in the past when I had all these quote unquote supports, when I was doing all these different things like fasting and reading my Bible and praying and all this ridiculousness. And it wasn't changing. So I realized that this isn't going to change. So that guilt that I used to feel about the specific things I had done, that guilt turned into shame, right? And that's for me where the shame really sort of was imprinted on me, right? That I was like, gosh, nothing's changing. I'm not changing. Therefore, if God's not the problem and God wants me to become straight and God wants me to be holy, and I'm not becoming that, well, it's not God's problem. It's my problem. I'm the problem. And when you see yourself as a problem, again, that's where the shame really kicks in. And so that's why I oftentimes say that it's like in the moment, it wasn't as bad as it was afterwards when, again, reality hit. I was no longer on Liberty's campus. I was not within a Liberty bubble. And I wasn't in this like dream world, this like fantasy world that evangelicals live in. Instead, I was in the real world and I was all of a sudden confronted with the reality that nothing was changing and that I was the quote unquote problem. Now, of course, fast forward a few years when I realized that it wasn't me that was the problem, it was the framework that was the problem, i.e., evangelicalism. Things got better quite quickly. But again, it took years of undoing all of the damage that had been done and getting rid of this mindset, which obviously for those of us who have deconstructed or are in the process of deconstructing, we know the affective and psychological power that this religious system has on us. And to deprogram takes a lot of work, a lot of emotional work, a lot of psychological work, sometimes even physical work. It takes a lot of work to get the hell out of that mindset. And so for me, that's where a lot of the difficulty and pain really, became a part of my experience, because I was no longer within this dream world. And once I was kicked into reality, I felt like I was kicked in the teeth and I was kicked in the stomach because I realized so much of what I had learned was a lie. But the problem was that it didn't start there. The problem was it started with me understanding myself as a problem, understanding myself as disgusting and dirty, and really hating myself for a very long time. That really was where a lot of the pain and difficulty came in. So that gives you perhaps a little bit more of an idea of what it was like during, and then of course what happened to me afterwards, and sort of the process of debarbing this theology and getting rid of this theology and ultimately just throwing it out. Because if I didn't, I don't think I would be here today.
That's so eye-opening because as somebody who has not gone through conversion therapy, I mean, of course I did my own attempts. You were describing some of the things, prayer and fasting and those types of things, but I never actually went through a program. And it's very eye-opening because my assumption, and probably the assumption of many people who think about what conversion therapy looks like, is that that shame would have been basically on you during the process of actually going through the therapy. But the idea that it oftentimes came after, in relation to you not getting the results over time that you were expecting or that you were even promised, if you will, that really is eye-opening, because then it becomes not the failure of the therapy, like you said, not God's problem. It becomes your failure, that somehow you didn't want it badly enough, or you didn't do this right enough, or whatever, of course, rationalization you might try to come up with. But that's really eye-opening. So for some, now you described, of course, well, first of all, you're here today, and we certainly thank God for that. There are some who are not. And obviously, in relation to the book that you wrote, you're having these conversations, or the edited volume, I should say, you're having these conversations. People are sharing their stories in relation to their own experiences of conversion therapy. Did you have, though, people that you knew who did make it?
Personally, thank goodness, no. I didn't know anyone who completed suicide. I know a number of other people who I talk to quite regular. I talk to a lot of people about different projects and different things as of recent, relating to this book, relating to other books, relating to a bunch of other things. But talking to a number of people recently, and obviously the topic of conversion therapy comes up a lot, just given the nature of my work. And a number of people have referenced folks who didn't make it. Like it's more common than I obviously want it to be, but it is quite common. It is not uncommon. It is frequent that people reference those who didn't make it. Now, if we want to talk about it in a different way of not making it, I think that there certainly is a conversation to be had, specifically for the folks who went through conversion therapy at Liberty, who didn't leave Liberty like me, which thank God I was single. I was out there trying, given the good old college, try to date women, and those poor women who had to put up with me. I feel terrible, and I apologize to all of you if you're listening. I was trying to date them very unsuccessfully, trying to convince myself and them that I was straight. Now, when I graduated, again, thank goodness, no woman wanted to date me, and for good reason. I think a lot of them caught on to me, but for a lot of the guys I know I can think of three guys in particular who I went to conversion therapy with, or what just was at Liberty with, um, and a number of them went to conversion therapy elsewhere. And so I think about three of them. And I'm thinking about one friend in particular. He was the first friend I ever came out to. He was the first friend I ever came out to. He and I was our freshman year. And this was like a few weeks into school. It was a few weeks of me after, I had hooked up with my spiritual life director. I had a spiritual life director on my hall. We had two RAs, and we had a bunch of prayer leaders, and I hooked up with one of them. And he didn't want to talk to me. Well, moments after we we hooked up, and he didn't. And for about a year, he didn't talk to me. He tried to talk to me later. And anyway, long story short, we actually don't have to get into that. Coming back to what we're talking about, this had happened, but he didn't want to talk to me. And so I was left, reeling. I was like, well, this is my first sort of sexual experience in a lot of ways. And then there have been other, whatevers. But this was the real sort of first thing that I had ever really done. And I felt terrible because, again, I was immediately rejected by someone who I had, done this with. And I had nobody to talk to. So I was, every evening going out to the parking lot and crying and, just like a sad boy. I wrote like a poem, and I was like super upset. And so I wrote this poem. And I remember my friend Michael, he said, hey, I can tell that you're upset, something's going on. I said, yeah, I'd love to talk to you about it, but I don't really think we can, because if I tell you, then, well, I don't think you're going to want to talk to me or be my friend anymore. He's like, well, why would that be? I said, oh, I can't tell you. But I said, but I did write a poem about it. Can I read you the poem? And so I read him this god awful poem, and shared him this ridiculously very thinly veiled poetic version of what had happened. And he said to me after I finished the poem, and he always had these funny quivery lips whenever we talked about anything sexual. He had these funny quivery lips, and so he goes, I think I know what the poem's about. And his lips are they're shaking away. And I was like, oh shoot, my cover's been blown, like he knows. And I said, well, what do you think the poem's about? And he said, well, I can't guess, because if I guess and I'm wrong, I'll be embarrassed. I said, well, why would you be embarrassed? He said, because I struggle with that as well. So if you're not struggling with that, but I am, then you're going to know that I am. And I was like, and what? And he was like, and it was this back and forth sort of stumbling. Within minutes, we're like, we struggle with same-sex. Oh, I struggle with same-sex attraction. In other words, like the Christianese for I'm gay.
Right.
And so we both, come out to each other. Well, fast forward, when I was graduating, he was graduating. I think he graduated just after me. But by the time I was graduating, at least, he was dating this gal that we both knew. Well, fast forward like a year after that, he's engaged. And a year after that, he's married to this woman. And then fast forward a year after that, or two after that, he has a child, and he's got another child. So I remember when I was seeing all these sort of like announcements. This is like when Facebook was bigger. And so seeing everything on Facebook, and, seeing like, oh my gosh, he's engaged now. Now he's married, and now he's a kid. Now he's another kid. I remember when I saw the first kid announcement, I was like, well, the nail's in the coffin. Like, this guy's going to be in there forever. And what happened was that I went back. I was living in Nashville at the time, and I went back to Lynchburg, which is where Liberty is. I was passing through to go to for a research trip up in Connecticut, and so I was driving through. So I stopped, and I was hanging out with my cousin who lives there, and she said, "Oh, Michael wants to hang out," and I'm like, "Oh my God, Michael! Okay, let's frickin' see Michael." And Michael, again, at this point was married to this gal. And I remember I told him at the time, like, I'm out and I'm gay. And at the time it was my ex-boyfriend. I was like, here's my boyfriend. And he was, again, quivery lips, all excited. And he was like, can I talk to you sometime about this? I was like, sure. He's like, and so, because he's like, does God think it's okay? Do you think it's okay? What does the Bible say? And so asking like a mile a minute, all these questions about, me saying that I'm no longer like fighting it. I am who I am. Well, he never talked to me, he never called. And again, I saw these announcements afterwards that he had these kids and all this kind of stuff. Well, I had written an article about that experience. Actually, the book, The Same-Sex Attraction, I write about this. That's what my chapter is. It's about this experience in group conversion therapy. So I'd written an article about group conversion therapy. And part of that article, I talked about Michael. I didn't use his name, and, I used a pseudonym for him at the time because he wasn't out and he was married. And I'm not out here trying to like out people just for the fun of it. And so I had used a pseudonym. Well, I called him in the article Gabriel. And fast forward to a year and a half ago, I get this message on Facebook, and all I saw was a URL to the article. And I knew because it was like, had the title of the article and the name. And I was like, oh my God. Michael saw the article. Michael's finally, because I never knew, did he read the article? Did he see the article? Because I wrote about him. I didn't use his name. I didn't give any identifying information. But again, the story was about him, and it was clearly about him. If had he read it, he would have known. No one else would have, but he would have. Well, I get the URL on Facebook on my lock screen. I just see the lock screen. It says like, he sends me this message, and then the next message it says Gabriel in quotation marks, him, has come out. Like he left his wife and he's out now. And I was like, what? And so I looked up and I saw it, and sure enough, we start talking, and he says like, yeah, I'm out now, and he's out now, and so he doesn't care if I use his name at this point because he's like out and proud and living that like wonderful gay life in Lynchburg now. But at the time, when I read the article, I didn't want out him, but he's now left his wife, all this kind of stuff. Long story short, what my whole point is here is that he's a success story as well. Yes, there were casualties. Yes, the woman to whom he was married, I feel terrible for him. I think he feels terrible for her. I think she probably is, obviously dealing with a lot, having to deal with the fact that she was married to a gay man. But Michael's one of a few of the 3 gays that I can list off the top of my head who got married. And he's one of 2 who actually got a divorce. The other one hasn't gotten a divorce. That other one still is in a relationship with a woman to whom he is married and has children, and was actually quite angry when Michael came out and when the other guy who we all knew when he came out. Why? It's self-hatred. It's anger at himself.
Yeah.
It's projection that he's upset with himself for what he's done and the decisions he's made. Again, part of an evangelical system, part of a greater sort of like control structure that has pushed him in this direction. But nonetheless, he's mad at himself for staying there. And these guys saying, no, F this, I'm out. I'm not doing this anymore. And I've left. And so when we talk about casualties, no, I don't know anyone who has completed suicide. And again, thank God. But for those who are casualties in other forms, 100%. And those are just a few of them, specifically from when I was at Liberty, and those who also went through conversion therapy or just went through Liberty when I was there.
And I didn't go through conversion therapy myself, but I myself also got married to a woman. And I think about we were married for like 6 years before I actually became affirming. I did a study on homosexuality and found out, wait a minute, God doesn't have a problem with this. I was like, what am I going to do with this now? I'm married, I'm pastoring the church. What am I supposed to do with this? So yeah, there is, I hate to phrase it this way, but I think it applies. There can be a lot of collateral damage to our own journeys. And I think that if we try to commit, even with people that we're helping or talking to, there are people who come to me, asking questions about being gay and they're still wrestling. And even if they don't necessarily buy the theology and the conversation that we have and the questions that I answer for them, and they're still going to go that route, the route of trying to be straight, trying to be delivered, if you will. One of the things I really try to encourage people to do is think about the collateral damage. Even if this is a choice that you're going to make for yourself, try not to drag other people into those choices, because they matter too, right? And in many ways they're innocent of it. Certainly there are people who can say, well, she knew. Perhaps she did. Perhaps she didn't. We don't know. It's so complex. It's so complex. So I'm really looking forward to being able to dive more into the different stories that are being shared, because in shame, sex, attraction, I said it right. I kept wanting to say shame, sex. I'm like, I know it's not that. Shame, sex, attraction. Because these different stories provide different experiences and angles, and everybody's story doesn't look alike. And I'm sure that there are people who can read this and find themselves somewhere in some of these stories, and to find some degree of hope that even if I find myself here now, there's still an other side to this that I may not be able to see. So on that point of other side, now that you're on the other side, this is something of a intellectual exercise. But now that you're on the other side, if you could take, I keep referencing the Matrix. If you could go, take the red pill, blue pill, if you could make the choice to go back to be reborn, but this time to be born straight, knowing what you know, having experienced what you've experienced, what choice would you make?
I would never, ever make the decision, if that, we could make the decision to become straight. I always say I don't want to be bored. You know what I mean? Like, it just doesn't sound like the most fun. I mean, and for anyone who is straight and takes that as a personal attack, which is kind of hilarious because it was a joke. But if in fact someone is to be upset by that, what I mean by that, what I'm pointing to with the joke, again, it is a joke, is that I don't ever want to be told I have to live a certain way. And some people say like, oh, that's just the gays in general. They just don't want to be told what to do. And it's like, no, like there are certain rules and things that I do that I follow that everyone else follows. It's like, laws and whatnot, things that are legal and illegal, this kind of stuff. Like there are a lot of things I do out of duty or obligation or because I have to, right? And for me, though, there are a lot of things that are unnecessary, and these are rules or obligations or duties that are placed upon us that are simply unnecessary, right? And really, I'm thinking about the idea of performing a certain brand of masculinity. If we are to talk, and obviously we're talking about gender and sexuality right now, and things that are related to my past and trying to change these things. I am not like a hyper masculine macho man. I'm not, and I never will be, and I don't want to be because that's just not who I am. And I, wherever I land on the gender spectrum, that's where I land, and that's just who I am, and I'm not changing that for anyone. And if they want to change, well, they can go, suck a banana. I don't know, like it's not, I don't care. But what I will say is that it's so funny that people expect me or you or others, anyone who's queer in some, genderqueer, sexually queer, that we have to follow a certain script. Right? We're told that we have to follow, a certain script of masculinity if we are a biological or a cis man, should I say more accurately, or if we are assigned female at birth, they have to follow, what it means to be a woman. This stupidity, right? It's where we are given a script, and that's exactly what it is. It's a script. It's what actors do. It's what actors follow, and I don't ever feel the need that I need to follow a script that has been given to me. Why? Because I didn't consent to it. I didn't ask for this. I don't want this, right? And it's funny that others expect me to. Others expect me to follow a script. Others expect me to act, to perform. Again, going back to performance and acting, it's so funny that oftentimes this is coming from those who are pushing, it's not us who are saying, oh, you need to act this way. It's us saying, no, be who you are and be whoever the heck you are, wherever that, leads you, cool. Just be you. Whereas so often either those who are straight or those who are trying to pretend they're straight are telling others, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. I don't need to do this. I don't, for what purpose? Right? For inauthenticity, for me to act and to be something that I'm not? No, that's not my life, and that will never be my life. And so I just find it funny that, I am expected to act a certain way, and I'm expected to be a certain way, or I'm supposed to be straight, or I'm supposed to, be a real man,
Right.
whatever the hell that is. I have zero desire. I have zero desire for that. And so if someone says, oh, if you could choose to be straight, it's like, well, no, I don't want to be, because if you're straight, so often what you have to do is you have to follow these scripts. You have to follow the, not just the white picket fence, nuclear normalcy script, but also like, if you want to pick up, a woman, or if you want to pick up a man, if you're a man or you're a woman or whatever, you have to act a certain way. Whereas what I find really beautiful about the queer community is that, not to say that there aren't those like, gender police out there, because there certainly are. And there's those guys who are like, I only like masculine guys, or I only like that. Like, it's like, what the hell is that? Like, shut up. But putting those aside, they're thankfully, not as common as what you find within the straight community. Within the straight community, you have so many people who are expecting a certain gender performance, and sexual performance. They're expecting certain things from you that are not necessarily expected from you in the queer community. Again, the queer community is not perfect. It's not like everyone's, a saint, by no means. And obviously that's not true. But it is much more open and much, you're freer just to be. And that I find to be wonderful. And I find that to be beautiful. And I'm so thankful that I'm a part of a community that is at least trending in that direction and pushing for everyone just to be themselves, as opposed to a community that constantly is policing each other and constantly telling themselves and others, including me and their children, to act a certain way. Because, dear God, that sounds miserable. And so that's why I would say, no chance in hell would I want to be straight at any point. I'm very thoroughly delighted.
I second that. I absolutely love that. Free to just be. Free to just be. Luke, I am so thankful for you coming on and sharing. I am so thankful for the work that you have done and are continuing to do in this important area. Like I said, as much as I've done in writing books and having conversations and doing debates and all kind of stuff, I've never had this conversation about conversion therapy. So thank you so very much. I definitely hope to have the opportunity to have you back, because there's still so much more that we can talk about. These are ongoing conversations that need to happen. And so thank you for being a part of that. In these last few moments, could you just let people know how they can reach out to you, how they can get in touch with you if they have questions or want to get your book, where they can find that at?
Yeah, so if you're in the US and you're looking for the book, you can find it on bookshop.org. It's great because they support local bookstores. Otherwise, you can get on Barnes& and Noble's website. If you're in Canada, Indigo, or there's another website that's escaping my mind. Oh, University of British Columbia Press. You can also just get it straight from the press, which is JKP Books, Jessica Kingsley Publishers. But otherwise, if you want to follow me online, I'm at Luke Slam Dunk Wilson on Instagram, on Threads, on Blue Sky. And then on Twitter, I tried to keep things consistent, and my handle is Wilson_FW. So, oops, there's that. But then, on Facebook and LinkedIn and all that kind of stuff too. So, would love to interact. I love the interaction. So, yeah, please do follow, and let's chat.
Well, thank you again. I really look forward to seeing the engagement and how this ongoing conversation will continue to evolve. I look forward to having another conversation with you. Thank you again for taking the time and making yourself available. Listen, everybody, if you want to be connected, I encourage you to youtube.com/@faith-evolution and the number 7. Subscribe to the page, to the YouTube channel, because we are having these types of real conversations, and we're going nowhere but up, because these are the conversations that need to be had. So again, thanks for joining. We look forward to seeing you at the next appointed gathering time. Till next time, peace.